Most modern comic book creators would love to have the career that Alan Moore has had, where his comic books, 30 years later, are all still in print. People are still reading them, people are still buying them, and most importantly, people are still talking about what Alan Moore did during his comic book career. He's kind of wound that down. He's moved on. He doesn't want to do comic books anymore, and he's quite frankly pretty salty, especially towards DC Comics. He's kind of sworn off the medium altogether. He's doing a lot more novels and things like that. And recently he had an interview with the Telegraph, I believe, and he started talking about his time at DC Comics, what he's doing with his royalties now, and some of his issues with the comic book industry. And I'm looking at you, Tom King. He's talking directly to you, sir. He don't like what you're doing. And I agree wholeheartedly with Alan Moore. People have taken what he started and ran with it in the absolute wrong direction. And I can also understand why Alan Moore is a little bit salty. It's not like The Watchmen is based on any DC characters. It's not like The Watchmen are based on the Charlton characters that DC owned that he wanted to do to begin with. He ended up making them creator-owned original characters, but he never got the rights to The Watchmen back. DC Comics keeps them in perpetuity until it goes out of print or they aren't making new projects based on The Watchmen. And it's always in print, and they're always making new projects based on The Watchmen. Remember Doomsday Clock? Remember Before Watchmen or whatever that series was? Obviously, you had the TV show on HBO. You also had the movie. And you can always get a fresh copy of The Watchmen in your comic book shop because that's one of the comic books that still sells. He had some other pretty big successes at DC Comics. If you want to remember The Killing Joke, pretty much redefined the Joker as a character. He cannot shake that either. Obviously, he had Saga the Swamp Thing, which I personally believe is the greatest work in Alan Moore's career. That is one of the greatest comic book stories ever written. Anatomy Lesson is probably the single greatest comic book issue I have ever read in my life. The writing of Alan Moore with the art of Stephen Bissette is absolutely amazing. Nobody in comic books today, not even the highest echelon writers, can really even touch that stuff. It's so good. It's so timeless, and it's still relevant to this day. And that's why his comic books are still in print. People are still reading them. And it does suck that Alan Moore isn't more content with his legacy, isn't happier with his career that he had, maybe the relationship that he has with DC Comics, but he's saying no more. I don't even want any more of their money anymore. While speaking to his own works like Watchmen and V for Vendetta, both of which have been adapted for the screen, the artist, who has long refused to have his name attached to screen adaptations of his work and has frequently been critical of said adaptations, revealed he stopped sharing royalties with the movie's writers. Moore said, "I no longer wish to even be shared with them. I don't really feel with the recent films that they have stood by what I assumed were their original principles. So I asked for DC Comics to send all the money from any future TV series or films to Black Lives Matter." Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. From what I understand, and I assume this is kind of like the same way now as it was 3 or 4 years ago, Warner Brothers and DC Comics pay out way better than Marvel and Disney do when it comes to adapting your comic book material for the big screen or even on television or whatever. I've certainly heard from Ethan Van Sciver and others that Warner Brothers were very generous when compensating when they took their DC Comics work and put it on another medium. And I imagine we will see some more Watchmen stuff in the future, and it will be a pretty penny, but he wants no more of it. He's giving it all to Black Lives Matter, which I think is an interesting choice, but hell, it's his money. In fact, it's not his money. He said he doesn't even want it. And I do believe I would make a different choice, but I'm also a father with 3 young kids, and I would probably just keep the money and send my kids to private school and maybe go on vacation and stuff like that. But there's a good chance because Alan Moore has been so successful that maybe he doesn't even need the money, and he wants to have principles. And I will applaud him for standing by what he believes. It's not always the easiest thing in the world to do, and he has been very upset with the treatment his Watchmen characters have gotten over the years. Although I will admit this, and you guys know as well as I know, I do not like Zack Snyder. I do not think he's a very good filmmaker, especially if he's going to like write it and have any type of artistic vision regarding the story itself. But his adaptation of the Watchmen movie is probably as faithful an adaptation of the Watchmen that you could ever put on the big screen in under like 5 hours. I think he actually did a pretty darn good job there. The costumes were good. I think the casting was absolutely phenomenal. They changed the ending, but the giant squid thing was never really going to work in movies. And I think the ending that they did have in the movies was absolutely fine. If there's one thing I would change about the Watchmen movie that would make it better is the Hallelujah song scene, which I thought was absolutely Grating is a word, disgusting. It just did not fit the tone and tenor of the movie or any of that stuff. It just seemed like Zack Snyder was trying to be a little bit too artistic with that one. Otherwise, I think he did the best that he could. Now, The Watchmen on HBO, was that Aronofsky or whatever? I can't even remember who made that one, but that was not The Watchmen. And I can understand why he would be mad about that. And I can understand why maybe he would be mad about Doomsday Clock, despite having a writer of the quality of Jeff Johns introducing to the DC universe. But did it ever really need to happen? Probably not. It was kind of a good idea if you wanted to make money, but like as a creative idea on its own merit, I just don't think it ever really held water. But it was a good series. I mean, Jeff Johns did the best that he could with it, even though they changed the hell out of it. So Alan Moore is still not happy with DC Comics, and he's not taking his royalties for any TV, film adaptations, for The Watchmen, or any of his stuff. He's sending it all to BLM. You know, hey, somebody is going to buy a house with that money. That's all I'm going to say. So good on you, putting people in hopes. Alan Moore to the rescue. He had more to say in the interview, which I thought was very interesting. This is when he's talking directly to Tom King. He doesn't say it, but I know what he really meant. Discussing the growth of adult fare in the comic industry, Moore addressed his own role in it, noting, I didn't mean my experiments with comics to be immediately taken up as something that the whole industry should do. When I was doing things like Watchmen, I was not saying that dark, psychopathic characters are really cool, but that does seem to be the message that the industry took for the next 20 years. Absolutely. I'm glad you said it, because I've been trying to say this for a while, basically since I've had my channel. I think Alan Moore is a genius. I think Watchmen is really good. I think Saga of the Swamp Thing is absolutely brilliant. I think V for Vendetta is really good. There's a lot of great stuff when you look at his ledger as far as what he's created. And certainly he's always going to be best known for The Watchmen. And it's kind of like what Mark Miller said recently when he was on the channel. He's like, Alan Moore was Oppenheimer. He created the nuclear bomb. And then you have all these morons just dropping bombs all over the place that had no idea the power that they were using and how they could actually destroy so much stuff. And you have writers like Tom King at DC Comics who, in their heart of heart, their greatest wish in this world is being Alan Moore. So instead of going out there and redefining the industry, redefining what comic books can be, they continuously just regurgitate Alan Moore's leftovers trying to be him. And obviously, a lot of these writers just aren't anywhere near the quality of a writer that Alan Moore is, and they just drop the ball and destroy things left and right because they don't know the craft. I don't think they even understand when they look at a lot of the work that Alan Moore did, what he was truly getting at. They just saw, well, he took this character and made him really dark, so that's the way to do it. But they never understood why he made that character dark. What made the character story interesting? What was the final resolution? Where did you need him to get back to if you wanted him to be a hero again? Or if you didn't want him to be a hero again, what can you do with the character later? There are all these cause and effects things that are happening when you talk about Alan Moore's work. And all these people want to emulate Alan Moore, but they never actually wanted to learn from Alan Moore and what he did and why it was successful and why it was groundbreaking. Nobody wants to be the next Alan Moore, as in the guy that introduces a concept or a story that changes the way people feel about comic books and the consumer when they read it, the way that they feel about it and where it could go. Places they didn't even realize were in the future for comic books are now available because of what Alan Moore had done at the time. And I do not believe I'm overstating that. They don't want to be that Alan Moore. They just want to be super dark, edgelord, eyes worship snake gods Alan Moore, which I guess in concept would be kind of easy. You just go, well, he took a giant shit on this character. I'll take a giant shit on a character. And they never realized what made Alan Moore special was because he was groundbreaking. He was innovative. He was doing something other people really weren't doing. Really, the only person that was a peer to Alan Moore that was doing something similar would be like a Frank Miller. And I don't know, I guess Alan Moore doesn't even like him. According to the interview, he thought he went too far with Sin City. I was like, man, you need to read your own work. Maybe you're sniffing your own farts, Alan Moore. But when you're that creative and you're that successful, I wouldn't blame you. I'd be huffing my own farts too. He had something else to say that I thought was very interesting. Apparently, he does not like dwarves. Moore lamented what the fantasy genre has been shaped into by the success of shows like Game of Thrones and films like Lord of the Rings. Fantasy these days seems to have been boiled down to a kind of J.R.R. Tolkien, George R.R. Martin world of warriors and dragons, and for some reason, dwarves. The fantasy books that inspire me are things like Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy, which is actually about the real world in some ways, the changing nature of British society, Fantasy has no restrictions whatsoever, so it's a bit lame to be constantly hitting the same note on the piano. Let's have fantastic visions that nobody has ever seen before and lay off people of restricted height for a change. I don't know why he's really hammering home that he doesn't like dwarves, but my goodness, I feel like this is a ginormous misread of J.R.R. Tolkien as far as talking about things that are actually happening in society. Like, there's a lot of undertones when you go read Lord of the Rings of people turning away from nature and moving into cities and turning towards technology and no longer respecting the earth and taking care of it. That is all the way through that entire story. He was absolutely hammering that one home, and it felt like he was absolutely using the genre of fantasy to talk about things that were happening in the real world. And here we are, 50 years later, a majority of the population of this earth today lives in cities than outside of rural areas. And it was never like that before because J.R.R. Tolkien was noticing that. We're chopping everything down. We're destroying everything. We're moving into these gross, disgusting cities. I think Alan Moore might have missed the boat on that one. Maybe not giving J.R.R. Tolkien the credit he deserves just because there are some dragons and there's certainly some warriors in the story. And maybe it wasn't his flavor of fantasy, but that is one of the cool things about the fantasy genre. It's so malleable. You can almost do anything. You could tell any story in fantasy, and you get to add all these amazing elements on top of it. It's like making a sundae, and you just have so much fun with it. Although I am with him. I am so tired of hearing the term, then they went full Game of Thrones. Anytime somebody gets murdered in like a sword and sandals or fantasy story, or they go back into history and they're talking about the War of the Roses and they're like, oh my God, this thing is full Game of Thrones. It's like, come on, George R.R. Martin just ripped off the War of the Roses that really happened and threw it into Game of Thrones and a couple other things in British history into there. There's an event that really happened that inspired the Red Wedding. George R. R. Martin didn't inspire history. He was inspired by history. And I listen to a lot of history podcasts about things that happened. And I am very interested in British history, especially. And they're always talking about this is full Game of Thrones. It's like, no, Game of Thrones full on just ripped off this story and adapted into a story. That's what happened here. So if I never have to hear the term went full Game of Thrones on us again in my lifetime, I'll be a happier person. But I don't have the same exact criticisms of the fantasy genre that Alan Moore does, but my goodness, this man is so pissed off at DC Comics, he's giving his money away so that the figureheads and BLM could buy more mansions. I don't know, man. It's his money. He can do whatever he wants with it, but I feel like you could help some orphans out. Maybe you could put a homeless family into a house or pay them some rent. Maybe get them a year-long rent or something with that, buddy, rather than buying somebody a new car that probably doesn't need it. But like I said, it's his money. He can do what he wants. But Alan Moore, still salty as fuck over his time at DC Comics and what happened with the Watchmen. And it's your fucking fault, Tom King. I blame you. And trust me, he might not have explicitly said it, but fucking Alan Moore blames you too. You fucking ruined everything he did with Watchmen. You learned all the wrong lessons. You're an asshole. Now, if you're a fan of Alan Moore, or maybe your first time hearing about Alan Moore, you're like, hey, he was a great comic book writer. It just so happens on this channel, we did a career retrospective. Eric Breen, Joe Corallo, and myself talk about Alan Moore and his career. Certainly, we're going to hit on Saga of the Swamp Thing. We're going to hit on Watchmen, but we're also going to hit on his Marvel time, his indie time, and all the stuff in between. Absolutely fantastic stuff. If you want to learn more about Alan Moore and some of his great contributions to comic books that he wishes he never did, but I'm glad he did it. Right here, there's also a link in the video description.